Distance rarely announces itself when it first arrives. It slips in quietly, disguised as patience, as space, as the temporary pause people tell themselves they need to breathe. At the beginning, distance doesn't feel dangerous. It feels reasonable, even healthy, a way to avoid conflict, a way to cool down, a way to keep things from getting worse. That's why no one notices it taking root. In the early stages, distance is still flexible. It feels reversible. People believe closeness will return on its own, that time will soften what tension hardened. They assume distance is a phase, not a direction, and that assumption is what allows it to grow. At first, distance looks like fewer conversations, less urgency to explain, more moments where silence feels easier than speaking, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it feels exhausting. When people are still emotionally connected, distance feels uncomfortable. It creates anxiety. It demands resolution. But when emotional fatigue sets in, distance starts to feel like relief. Relief is the first warning sign. Relief means something that once required effort has been set down. It means the emotional weight of engaging has become heavier than the cost of pulling back. That doesn't happen overnight. It happens after patterns repeat without change. Promises are made, expectations are raised, then nothing shifts. Over time, people learn something quietly but definitively. Closeness doesn't lead to improvement. It leads to disappointment. Once that lesson is learned, distance stops feeling temporary. It becomes protective. Distance begins to function as a boundary, a way to limit exposure to frustration, a way to manage disappointment before it arrives. People don't say they're doing this. They often aren't fully conscious of it themselves. They just notice they're calmer when they don't engage as much. Calmer doesn't mean happier. It means less strained. At this stage, distance still looks harmless from the outside. People still show up, they still participate, they still fulfill roles. Nothing appears broken enough to demand attention. But something important has changed internally. The desire to close the gap has weakened. When distance is temporary, people miss each other emotionally. They feel the gap, they talk about it, they try to bridge it. When distance starts becoming permanent, people stop missing what's gone. They adapt to its absence. Adaptation is quiet. It doesn't ask permission. Another shift happens in expectations. People stop expecting emotional responsiveness. They stop waiting for understanding. They stop being surprised when it doesn't arrive. Lowered expectations reduce pain, but they also reduce connection. Once expectations drop, effort follows. Effort is always proportional to belief. When belief fades, effort shrinks without announcement. This is how distance becomes normalized, not through rejection, through adjustment. People begin planning emotionally around the gap instead of trying to close it. They rely on themselves more. They invest energy elsewhere. They stop placing emotional weight on interactions that no longer support it. None of this requires a decision. It happens because humans are wired to reduce pain. Distance becomes a coping mechanism before it becomes a conclusion. Another reason distance solidifies is because conflict fades with it. Less engagement means fewer arguments. Fewer arguments create the illusion of peace. But peace without connection is not resolution. It's avoidance that has learned how to function. When conflict disappears without being resolved, it doesn't vanish. It settles underneath everything else. It becomes part of the foundation. Distance builds on that foundation. Over time, silence stops feeling tense. It stops demanding explanation. It becomes the default. Default states are hard to reverse. The most dangerous part of this process is that nothing feels urgent anymore. There's no breaking point, no dramatic signal that something needs immediate attention. Everything feels manageable, and what feels manageable is rarely questioned. People often assume permanent distance is the result of a single event, a betrayal, a fight, a decision. But more often, it's the result of many moments where reaching out felt pointless, where trying again felt heavier than letting go a little more. Each of those moments widens the gap, and once the gap becomes wide enough that people can live comfortably on their own side of it, the motivation to cross it disappears. Distance doesn't become permanent because people stop caring entirely. It becomes permanent because caring starts to hurt more than not caring as much. That shift is subtle. It's easy to miss. It doesn't announce itself as an ending. It feels like survival.
And by the time anyone realizes distance isn't temporary anymore, it has already reshaped how people think, feel, and relate to one another. The next part will explore how silence replaces effort, and why once silence becomes habitual, closeness becomes almost impossible to restore. As distance settles in, effort begins to change long before anyone admits it has. At first, the changes settle. People still do what's required. They respond. They participate. They show up when expected. But what disappears is the extra effort, the effort that comes from wanting to be close rather than needing to maintain appearances. That distinction matters. Effort driven by obligation feels different from effort driven by connection. One is mechanical, the other is emotional. When distance starts becoming permanent, emotional effort quietly drains away. People stop initiating difficult conversations, not because the issues are gone, but because revisiting them feels pointless. They already know how those conversations end. They already know what won't change. Silence starts to replace effort. Silence isn't chosen all at once. It emerges because speaking up stops feeling productive. When people feel unheard repeatedly, they don't shout louder, they speak less. Eventually, they stop speaking at all. What replaces effort isn't indifference right away, it's calculation. People begin choosing which battles are worth the energy and which aren't. Over time, fewer and fewer things qualify. That calculation becomes automatic. Another shift happens in emotional availability. People listen, but they don't absorb. They acknowledge feelings, but they don't engage with them deeply. Empathy becomes polite rather than invested. That kind of distance is hard to call out because nothing is overtly wrong. No cruelty, no obvious neglect, just a gradual thinning of emotional presence. And that thinning changes everything. Another sign that distance is solidifying is how people respond to disappointment. Early on, disappointment sparks frustration or sadness. Later, it sparks adjustment. Instead of reacting emotionally, people adapt practically. They stop expecting certain things. They stop relying on others for emotional reassurance. They stop placing weight on moments that used to matter. Adaptation reduces pain, but it also reduces intimacy. Another way silence replaces effort is through timing. Responses become slower. Follow-ups don't happen automatically anymore. Conversations lose momentum, not out of malice, out of diminished priority. When someone or something matters deeply, it creates urgency. When urgency fades, it's because importance has shifted. Another subtle change is how people talk about problems. Language becomes neutral, flat, non-confrontational. Instead of "this hurts" or "this matters," the tone becomes "it is what it is." That phrase alone signals resignation. Resignation is a quiet form of acceptance, and acceptance, once reached, rarely reverses. Another reason silence takes over is because it brings relief. Silence doesn't demand vulnerability. It doesn't risk disappointment. It doesn't invite conflict. For people who have spent a long time trying and failing to be understood, silence feels like rest. That rest is seductive. Once people experience the calm that comes from not engaging, re-engaging feels disruptive. Emotional closeness starts to feel intrusive rather than comforting. That's when distance crosses a critical threshold. Another change happens in how people imagine the future. Plans become shorter term, vague, conditional. There's no excitement attached to imagining things far ahead together. When people stop imagining a shared future, closeness loses its anchor. Another reason distance becomes permanent is that people stop asking for reassurance. They stop checking whether they matter. They stop seeking validation, not because they no longer need it, because they no longer expect to receive it. That shift is profound. When expectations adjust downward, people appear calmer, more composed, less reactive. From the outside, this can look like maturity or growth, but inside, it's often detachment. Detachment is protective, but it's also distancing. Another subtle sign is how people respond when closeness is offered. Instead of leaning in, they hesitate. They keep boundaries firm. They don't fully open up, not because they don't care, because opening up feels risky again. Once distance becomes associated with safety, closeness feels uncertain. Silence reinforces that safety. Over time, silence stops being something people endure and starts being something they prefer. It becomes the default way of interacting. Defaults are powerful. They shape behavior without conscious choice. By the time silence has fully replaced effort, closeness is no longer something people seek automatically. It has to be intentional, requested, explained.
And relationships don't survive long in that state. The next part will explore how this silent adjustment turns into emotional independence and why, once people no longer need closeness to feel stable, distance stops being temporary and starts becoming permanent. At a certain point, distance stops being something people manage and starts becoming something they build their lives around. This is where emotional independence quietly replaces connection. People no longer feel unsettled by the gap. They organize themselves around it. They stop waiting for closeness to return and begin functioning as if it won't. That shift changes everything. Emotional independence doesn't arrive with declarations. It forms through repeated moments where people realize they're steadier when they rely on themselves, when they stop expecting emotional consistency from others, when they stop anchoring their sense of security to relationships that feel unpredictable or draining. At first, this independence feels empowering. People feel calmer, more grounded, less reactive. They experience fewer emotional highs and lows. But independence built from distance carries a cost. It slowly dissolves interdependence. Interdependence is what allows closeness to survive tension. It's the understanding that even when things are difficult, people still need each other emotionally. When that need disappears, distance stops feeling like a problem to solve. It starts feeling like the solution.
Another sign this stage has arrived is how people handle vulnerability. They become more selective, more guarded. They share less, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer see sharing as necessary. Vulnerability without response teaches people to keep things to themselves. Over time, self-containment becomes the norm. Another subtle shift happens in emotional regulation. Instead of processing feelings through connection, people process them internally. They soothe themselves. They talk themselves through disappointment. They adjust expectations privately. This internal processing reduces friction, but it also reduces bonding. When people stop needing emotional exchange to feel okay, relationships lose one of their core functions. Another sign emotional independence has taken hold is how people respond to absence. They don't feel pulled to fill it. They don't feel anxious about it. They don't rush to reconnect. Absence feels neutral. Neutrality is powerful. It signals that the emotional bond has loosened enough that distance stops triggering concern. Another shift happens in identity. People begin to see themselves less as part of a shared unit and more as individuals moving alongside each other. Roles remain, but emotional identity separates. The language of we quietly becomes I, not out of defiance, out of alignment. Another reason emotional independence accelerates permanence is that it reduces motivation. Motivation to repair, to explain, to compromise, to bridge gaps. Those efforts require belief that closeness matters more than comfort. Once comfort is found in independence, closeness feels optional. Optional connections rarely survive long-term strain. Another important detail is that emotional independence often looks healthy from the outside. People seem stable, self-sufficient, less reactive, more composed. That appearance can mask the fact that connection has thinned dramatically. Calm doesn't always mean contentment. Sometimes it means detachment has settled in. Another sign this stage has been reached is how people react when closeness is attempted. Offers of deeper connection may feel awkward, unnecessary, or even intrusive. Not because they're unwanted, because they disrupt a new equilibrium. Once people have built a sense of safety around distance, closeness threatens that safety. Another reason distance becomes permanent here is that emotional independence removes urgency. There's no longer a sense that something needs to be addressed. Life feels manageable as it is. And what feels manageable is rarely challenged. Another subtle change is how people prioritize. Energy flows toward personal goals, individual stability, and self-directed fulfillment. Shared emotional projects lose importance. That shift doesn't require conflict. It simply reflects a change in where meaning is found. By the time emotional independence is fully established, distance is no longer a phase. It's a structure. People aren't waiting for reconnection. They've moved on internally. This is why distance becomes so hard to reverse at this stage. It would require dismantling the systems people have built to feel safe, stable, and whole on their own. And few people willingly undo stability once they found it.
The next part will explore how this emotional independence turns into visible separation, and why, once independence replaces connection, permanence is no longer a question of choice, but of reality. As emotional independence settles in, separation begins to take on a visible shape. Not because anyone makes a dramatic decision, because the structure can no longer hide the emotional distance holding it up. This is the phase where distance stops being internal and starts showing up in daily life. Schedules no longer align naturally. Time together becomes intentional rather than assumed. Shared moments feel planned instead of organic. The ease that once carried the relationship quietly disappears. People are still present, but they're no longer oriented toward each other. Another sign separation is becoming visible is how decisions are made. People stop checking in emotionally before choosing. They decide based on what works for them individually and communicate afterward, if at all. This isn't selfishness, it's independence expressing itself outwardly. Another shift appears in responsibility. People stop feeling responsible for the emotional climate. They don't try to fix tension. They don't smooth over awkwardness. They don't bridge silence. They allow space to exist without filling it. That allowance makes distance undeniable. Another reason this stage feels quiet is because there's no resentment driving it. Resentment burns hot. It demands expression. This distance is cooler, settled, almost neutral. Neutrality is often mistaken for peace, but peace without connection is simply absence of engagement. Another change shows up in how people talk about the past. They don't romanticize it. They don't demonize it either. They describe it plainly. Plain description is a sign of emotional resolution. Unresolved stories are told with intensity. Resolved ones are told with clarity. Another reason separation becomes obvious here is that people stop imagining repair. The idea doesn't feel hopeful. It feels unnecessary. When repair stops being imagined, permanence has already arrived. Another shift is how people respond when closeness is suggested. Instead of leaning in, they hesitate. They keep boundaries firm. They don't fully open the door. Not because they're rejecting the other person, because reopening closeness feels destabilizing. Distance has become the safer state. Another sign separation is taking form is relief becoming consistent. Relief from emotional obligation. Relief from negotiation. Relief from managing expectations. Relief reinforces behavior. People don't abandon what gives them relief. Another important detail is that nothing new needs to happen to justify this phase. There's no final straw, no inciting incident. The accumulation is enough. Distance becomes permanent not through decision, but through alignment.
Behavior aligns with internal truth. Another subtle shift is language. People stop using collective terms. Plans are described individually. Futures are imagined separately. That language shift alone confirms separation. Another reason this stage confuses outsiders is because everything looks calm. There's no chaos to point to, no breakdown to explain. But calm can be misleading. Calm can be the sign that everything important has already been decided. This is the moment where distance stops being something that might change and becomes something that defines the relationship. Not because anyone wanted it to, because nothing else fits anymore. The next part will explore why once distance reaches this stage, there's no conversation that can undo it, and why silence becomes the most honest ending once permanence has set in. By the time distance reaches the stage, conversation stops feeling like a solution, not because people don't care enough to talk, but because talking no longer feels capable of changing anything. This is the point where permanence sets in. When distance is temporary, conversation feels necessary. People believe that if they explain themselves clearly enough, if they find the right words, something might shift. There is still hope attached to being understood. But once distance becomes permanent, that hope disappears quietly. People already understand each other well enough to know where things stand. Another reason conversation fades is that clarity has already been achieved internally. They know what they feel, they know what they're willing to accept, they know what they're no longer willing to carry. There's no confusion left to resolve. When confusion ends, discussion loses its purpose. Another shift happens in emotional urgency. Nothing feels pressing anymore. There's no sense that something must be said before it's too late. Too late has already arrived. That realization doesn't feel dramatic. It feels calm, almost settled. Another reason silence becomes permanent is that people stop needing validation.
They don't need the other person to agree with them. They don't need acknowledgement to move forward. They've already validated themselves. Self-validation is powerful, but it also closes the door to negotiation. Once people stop seeking permission to feel the way they feel, distance becomes self-sustaining. Another subtle sign of permanence is how people respond when issues resurface. There's no emotional reaction, no frustration, no disappointment, just acceptance. Acceptance doesn't fight back. Another reason permanence sets in is that emotional independence has removed fear. Fear of being alone, fear of disruption, fear of starting over. When fear loses its hold, people no longer cling to closeness out of necessity. Distance stops feeling risky. It starts feeling appropriate. Another change is how people frame the situation in their own minds. They stop seeing distance as something to fix and start seeing it as something that simply is. Language shifts from "this needs work" to "this is how it is." That shift seals permanence. Another important detail is that there's no dramatic goodbye at this stage, no declaration, no official ending moment, because the ending already happened emotionally. What remains is alignment between inner truth and outward behavior. Another reason permanence is quiet is that grief has already been processed. The sadness arrived earlier, during the realization phase, during the repeated disappointments, during the gradual withdrawal. By now, grief has softened into acceptance. Acceptance doesn't scream, it steadies. Another sign distance has become permanent is relief becoming the dominant feeling. Relief from expectation, relief from effort, relief from emotional labor. People don't willingly give up relief. Relief anchors behavior more strongly than fear ever did. Another subtle shift is how people talk about the future. They don't speak in terms of repair or reunion. They speak in terms of continuity, continuing as they are or moving forward independently. There's no longing attached to those statements. Longing belongs to unresolved endings. This one is resolved. By this stage, distance isn't an absence anymore. It's a structure. It shapes how people interact, how they plan, how they define themselves. And structures don't collapse suddenly. They hold steady until they're replaced. The next and final part will explore how this permanence becomes the quiet ending, and why distance, once fully accepted, doesn't need explanation or closure to remain real. By the time distance reaches this final stage, it no longer feels like something that happened. It feels like something that has always been there. That's how permanence settles in, not as a shock, but as recognition. People stop thinking of the distance as a problem. They stop analyzing it. They stop wondering how it got there. It simply becomes the background of everything else, the quiet context in which all interactions now exist. This is where beings without drama fully reveal themselves. There is no last conversation because nothing is unfinished. There is no closure talk because closure already happened internally. There is no need to explain, defend, or justify what feels obvious. Distance doesn't ask to be understood. It just remains. What makes this kind of ending so difficult for outsiders to grasp is that it doesn't follow the rules people expect. There's no villain, no single cause, no moment to freeze frame and say that's when it ended. Instead, there's alignment, inner truth finally matching outward behavior. Once that alignment happens, people stop resisting what they already know. They stop acting against their own clarity.
They allow the distance to exist without trying to shrink it or fight it. That allowance is what makes it permanent. Another defining feature of the stage is peace. Not joyful peace, but settled peace. The kind that comes from no longer trying to be somewhere emotionally that you aren't. That peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from acceptance. People often confuse acceptance with giving up, but acceptance isn't defeat. It's honesty without struggle. It's acknowledging reality without demanding it be different. And once people reach that point, distance doesn't feel like loss anymore. It feels accurate. Another reason this distance holds is that nothing pulls people back. There's no emotional gravity left. No longing strong enough to override stability. No unresolved pain demanding attention. What once might have felt empty now feels neutral. Neutrality is powerful. Neutrality means the emotional charge is gone. Without emotional charge, there is nothing to reignite closeness. Another subtle truth is that this kind of ending doesn't erase what came before. The memories still exist, the history still matters, but it no longer directs the present. The past becomes something that's acknowledged rather than lived inside.
That's how people know they've moved on emotionally, even if circumstances haven't changed dramatically. Distance becomes permanent not because people stop caring entirely, but because caring changes form. It becomes quieter, more contained, less demanding. Care without attachment doesn't pull people together. It allows them to exist separately without conflict. This is why there was no dramatic ending, no explosive moment, no final scene that felt like closure. Because the real ending happened earlier, in all the moments where effort wasn't returned, where silence felt safer than speaking, where independence replaced connection, where acceptance replaced hope. By the time distance became visible, it was already irreversible, not because anyone made it that way, but because everyone had adapted to it. Distance became permanent because it stopped hurting, stopped surprising, and stopped being questioned. It became the truth everyone lived with, quietly, steadily, without needing to name it. And that's how things really end when they don't end in a fight, not loudly, but finally.